I am in Chile, and the work I do is strongly related to who I am and where I am. So my presentation has to do with these geopolitical matters and the fact that I work in the Global South and particularly in South America. So let's start. By the way, thank you for being here. Is the morning here, and I'm sure it's the afternoon and evening there. So thank you for being here. Internationalization has become a very strong narrative. I'm sure you are aware of all these narratives and the importance that internationalization has for higher education systems and institutions. So there are many publications in the academic world about internationalization, but also many reports emanating from global agencies or international agencies. So internationalization has become an important concept. And if you go to universities and you travel to different countries, you will see that internationalization is part of the vocabulary in universities, but also in other types of higher education institutions. So basically, internationalization has been connected with visibility, prestige, being competitive, and especially the idea of attracting students from all around the world. And of course, with attracting students, there is the issue of attracting funds and prestige. So there are symbolic issues here, prestige, but also economic drivers. The role of international rankings is very important here. International rankings give a very important role to international publications in mainstream journals, publications that are usually in English. And publications that are part of journals that are managed by international companies that are based in the global north, in Europe, in the United States, in Australia. So international rankings have become a very powerful tool to push universities around the world to very specific ways of being universities. What is expected from universities is connected with the idea of world-class university. So every university around the world wants to be this world-class university, international, with prestige, with a very important and salient research component, international publications, and also mobility across borders, mobility of students, mobility of academic staff. As I mentioned, the role of international agencies such as the World Bank, UNESCO, other agencies have been key here, because to some extent, this idea of internationalization, or this narrative about internationalization, has become a normative narrative. Normative in the sense that provides views about what is desirable, or in this case, the ways in which universities should behave, the kind of policies universities and higher education institutions should promote. So there is this normative aspect about where universities should go to. Yeah, so this has become a problematic matter in many senses. Especially for countries that are in the global south, and I'm going to elaborate on this in a little while. So my argument here is that internationalization is an homogenic narrative that push universities to become an institution that is to some extent universal. And as you know, universities are dependent on a specific contexts, a specific needs, and a specific problems. Yeah. So there are many problematic issues here, not only for the global south. I am aware, and I'm sure you are aware too, that internationalization as a very powerful driver is even problematic for countries in the global north, which whose higher education systems cannot compete with universities, with elite universities or world-class universities in the United States, or in the UK or in Australia. So, for example, in the south of Europe, there are many issues about internationalization. In Italy, in Spain, in Greece, or even in Poland, I'm sure there are a lot of problematic matters about internationalization and trying to emulate a model of university that is an Anglo-Saxon model of university, and that is very restrictive and difficult to reach for many reasons. But particularly in the global south, the issue of internationalization is problematic. Why? And also in Africa, and also in other countries that are former colonies, because there is a condition that has been called a post-colonial condition. So in countries that were former colonies, we have a lot of struggles and a lot of legacies that we need to deal with. In other words, when I say a colonial legacy, I'm talking about the past, but I'm also thinking about the ways in which this is a legacy. So currently, universities in South America have to deal with many issues related to colonial times. The fact that countries in South America became independent from Spain between the century 19 and 20 doesn't mean that we are not struggling right now with a colonial legacy. And this colonial legacy has to do with what is called in the literature as a powerful matrix, a powerful colonial matrix. So unfortunately, I don't have my that very nice image that I wanted to share with you, but it doesn't matter. So basically, it's a matrix, and that was established during colonial times, and that is based in race and labor divisions. What does that mean? It means that the colonizers, white Spaniards and Portuguese, were considered superior because of the color of their skin, but also because of the power they brought. So the colonizers not only were superior because of the color of their skin, but also because they were able to take the lands and the bodies of the Americas, of the indigenous people. And that meant that they were able to exercise supremacy and a lot of power upon the territories of the Americas. Interestingly, several sociologists and other social theorists in Latin America have mentioned that when we think about modernity, we usually link modernity with Europe, because modernity as a historical stage or as historical period of time took place in Europe. However, at the same time, in those years, many things were happening in the Americas, and one has to do with the discovery. I say quotations discovery because the Americans were there, and there were people living there with their very developed civilizations. So when they were discovered, there were a lot of resources that were taken by the colonizers from the Americas, and they were brought to Europe to develop many areas, social sciences, history. So the Enlightenment, to some extent, and the development of certain countries in Europe had to do with the discovery and the exploitation that took place in the Americas. So there is a financial matter there, an economic matter, that is very important. And many times this is not discussed when we talk about modernity in history. The other thing that is very interesting and that is addressed by Quijano, Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, is that this way of colonizing and establishing a matrix of power based on race and labor divisions that took place in the Americas was later exported to other process of colonization in Africa, for example, in Australia. So it's very interesting to read these literatures from an historical point of view. So this model of colonization emerged in the Americas, and according to Quijano and other sociologists, this was exported to other countries and other processes of colonization. And again, this matrix of power in which the white people were superior and the indigenous people were inferior, and at the same time, indigenous people were considered as slaves, for example, or their lands were taken and exploited, is a model that has characterized other colonizing processes. Anyway, so what I want to highlight here is that in Latin America we have to deal with this matrix of power. It is not something that took place in colonial times and then it was forgotten. It is an issue, it is a challenge that we have to live with nowadays. And if we think about universities in Latin America, we will see that there are many issues related to social inequities and stratification and the fact that students of color or from indigenous backgrounds have been struggling to access higher education. So social inequities and indigenous discrimination are deep inside higher education institutions in Latin America, and universities have had an important role in reproducing this matrix of power. So my point here is that because we have this colonial condition and this matrix of power that we have to deal with in Latin American higher education, because of this condition, internationalization becomes a very challenging matter for us, but also for countries in Africa, and also countries such as New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and Canada. What I argue in my presentation is that there are contending and competing narratives of internationalization in Latin America. So on the one hand, Latin America tries to emulate these global trends of higher education. So internationalization and a Western way of being a university is very important in Latin America. Yeah. So these Western perspectives about internationalization prevail in Latin American higher education. But on the other hand, internationalization can be seen as a new form of colonialism. And these critical voices have given way to new forms to think about internationalization. However, the issue is that these critical voices have remained somewhat marginalized. So what we can see in Latin America is a Western way of internationalization that is very prominent, and at the same time, critical voices about internationalization that are a bit in the shadow. If we analyze the very concept of internationalization, we will see that most of these definitions come from the global north, and particularly the USA, Canada, and European countries. Jane Knight, for example, was a pioneer in defining internationalization, and she offered a definition in 1993 and 1994, which is very generic, and you can find it here. The process of integrating an international or intercultural dimension into functions of teaching, research, and service of the institution. If you see this very generic definition in 1994, and then you compare it with a recent definition provided by Thondlana, you will see that there aren't very many differences. So according to Thondlana, internationalization involves physical and virtual cross-border interactions among academics, students, academic programs and providers, collaborative partnerships and ventures for teaching, learning, and research. I would say that this definition is a bit more concrete, but it's not very different from the definition provided more than 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago by Jane Knight. However, internationalization, if we critically read about internationalization, we will find that there is that internationalization is an evolving concept. So we will find several definitions that especially provided by Knight, who was trying to offer a generic definition of internationalization, and she's very explicit. She said in 2004, the challenging part of developing a definition of internationalization is the need for it to be generic enough to apply to many different countries, cultures, and education systems. Although it is not necessarily the intention to develop a universal definition, it is imperative that it be appropriate for use in a broad range of contexts and for comparative purposes across countries and regions of the world. I think that this thought that is provided by Knight in 2004 is very revealing of the idea of trying to have one generic definition that are applied to different contexts. However, there have been many discussions about internationalization and even criticisms. And for example, Hans de Witt, who is, let's say, one of the most important exponents of internationalization, has tried to move away from this generic and universal definition of internationalization because, and he has been very explicit, he has realized that it's not sustainable, it's not possible to think about internationalization in a generic way, and we need to be sensitive to context specificities. So in a definition that he provided in 2020, he mentioned that internationalization has a public purpose, and he tried to highlight an inclusive dimension so that nobody's left out. I think this is very telling, but this is quite recent. Anyway, Christian, you have to tell me how I'm doing with time, because perhaps I'm going too slow. You can interrupt me when
more or less
when
20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Yeah, more
Okay.
or less 20 minutes.
Okay, I don't have, let me see if I have okay, now I have my watch with me. Okay, so what I am going to do now is trying to analyze two very important concepts that have been connected to internationalization and that act as drivers to promote this hegemonic way of thinking about internationalization. And these two concepts are very strong and very important in higher education. One is quality, and the other one is economic growth. I'm going to start with the economic growth. Internationalization has been related to the concept of globalization. There is an interesting discussion about what is first, globalization of or internationalization. Some scholars say that internationalization is a response to globalization, and globalization involves this interconnectedness among countries and this interdependence between countries. Yes, and there is an economic, a technological, a political, social, and cultural interdependence. If you analyze globalization in its relationship with internationalization, we will find many reports emanating from supranational agencies highlighting the issue of economic growth. So, for example, here you have a quotation from the World Bank in 2002. Among the most critical dimensions of change are the converging impacts of globalization, the increasing importance of knowledge as the primary driver of growth, and the revolution of information and communication. So this is the World Bank. But then you have van der Wende, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry about that, but she's very well known. And this is a scholar work referring to internationalization as a response to globalization. And again, the economic part and the labor markets become very important for these definitions about internationalization. Then you have the International University Association saying central to globalization are the increased mobility of goods, services, and people, and the accelerating use of information and communication technologies to bridge time and space in unprecedented ways and at a continually decreasing costs. So again, you have the academic world and the policy world working together to highlight the economic dimension of internationalization. This type of definition is very problematic for the poorest countries, while for countries in the global north, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that it's easier, but we can see in the literature, in academic work, but also in reports produced by international agencies, that there is a very important, the important matter of generating income and attracting international talent. So the market forces are very important. To be honest, in South America, we cannot think about attracting international talent. I mean, international students don't come to Latin American universities because Latin American universities are not well positioned in international rankings. So for us, these kind of definitions are a bit far away. At the most, we have a couple of countries here in Latin America, Chile and Brazil, who have been developing a lot of research and are trying to attract students from Latin America. But we are not in a position like the United States or the UK to attract international students and generate income. The second dimension is the quality dimension, which is very powerful. So internationalization has been attached to quality, and let's put it in very simple words. Higher education institutions try to reach quality, try to offer education of quality or research of quality. So quality has become a very strong driver. And again, I'm not going to read all of these, but we can find a series of quotations in reports produced by the UNESCO in 1998, but also in 2019. Yes, so quite recently, there are a lot of reports from these international agencies pushing or connecting quality with internationalization. So quality is not only associated with research, but also with teaching and learning, including skills for the job market and entrepreneurship. This has been said by the World Bank in 2021. So let's talk about Latin America. In Latin America, these two issues, economic growth and quality, are two concepts that are very important for internationalization in Latin America as well. And there is an observatory in Mexico led by a leading scholar there. And if we analyze texts that have been produced by this observatory on internationalization, we will find a lot of texts and ideas that refer to quality, the idea of development, scientific development. Here I brought, an example from Chile. and a report produced by the OECD in 2009. But I can tell you that this is very, I mean, we still think in this way. The idea of promoting English, for example, learning English at the secondary level, the promotion of international exchanges. This, I mean, there are many policies in Chile pushing to these international exchanges, because there is the idea of symbolic capital, the idea of working and collaborating with prestigious universities, or the idea that we are going to produce fantastic papers and publish them in mainstream journals in English. So the government here in Chile and universities have taken these World Bank and OECD recommendations very seriously. And the idea is positioning Chile as a destination for international education. I don't think we have been able to do that. But what I am trying to say here is that these discourses, these narratives, are deep inside in Chile and in other countries in South America, and both universities and the policy organizations here in Latin America, and particularly in Chile, are pushing academics and universities towards this discourse that are very that belong to the global north. So when we think about regions that are poor, we need to acknowledge economic asymmetries, brain drains. We have very smart and clever students who travel and study programs, PhD programs, for example, in the global north, and they don't come back. That is an issue. We also have a lot of challenges and problems here in Latin America. Lacks accreditation methods. We don't have proper legislation regarding foreign campuses. We have issues about intellectual property. There are some regions or some countries and areas within our countries that are rural and they don't have access to technology. So it's very difficult to try to follow internationalization because there are a lot of financial restrictions. But also there are epistemic dependencies. And this was very nice put by Obamba and Wema in Africa, when they mentioned that when the global north collaborates with the global south, there are very important asymmetries. And basically the vision there is that rather than collaboration, there is assistance, because many of these programs try to assist weak researchers in the global south that don't have technology, that don't have laboratories, and basically we don't have research infrastructure to conduct proper research. So we face all these problems in the global south, in Latin America, but also in Africa. Okay, so I have 10 minutes left, I think, and I'm going to focus now on two different types of narratives that are critical of internationalization as an hegemonic narrative. So I distinguish two types of narratives that are critical with internationalization. On the one hand, one narrative that focuses on the idea of world-class university, that criticizes the power of the global north and the ways in which this model of world-class university has been imposing ways of being universities in South America. So if we analyze the literature, we will find a lot of papers criticizing. I myself have written a lot about publications in English, circuits of knowledge production. There are many publications about brain drain, the colonization of English, especially in the social sciences and the humanities. There are many pieces as well, many manuscripts about neoliberalism and the commodification of higher education, and the conceptualization of internationalization as a strategy that pursue economic growth. So this is let's say is one critical narrative that basically focuses on these global trends. However, these narratives is not very connected with the policy arena. So basically, I would say is academic work that is growing, especially in the last 5 years or perhaps 10 years. And so there is this growing criticism against the global north and the imposition of one model of university, a world-class university, and the issue of global rankings. The second narrative is a narrative that is not very well known in the global north. And one of the reasons why it is not well known is because most of the publications about these critical narratives are in Spanish and in Portuguese. So this critical voice, this second critical voice, is well known in Latin America. But of course, I wouldn't say that it's embraced by all the universities. But I think it's important to acknowledge this critical voice about internationalization. And this critical voice basically recognizes that we are a former colony and that we have to deal with the matrix of colonial power that I was mentioning when I started my presentation. So basically, this narrative consists of acknowledging our past and the ways in which colonial legacies are still here with us, and the ways in which universities produce, reproduce, and reinforce these colonial legacies. However, there is hope here because I think that the first step is recognizing the colonial legacy of our universities and our lands here and our countries in Latin America. But the second step is trying to dismantle, trying to not only criticize, but also trying to produce initiatives to deal with this colonial legacy. And here in Latin America, we have a very interesting tradition of intercultural universities, especially in Mexico and in Ecuador, for example, or indigenous universities that try to value and recover the indigenous knowledges. So in these universities, for example, the curriculum is organized around Western knowledges, science, traditional science, but also indigenous knowledges. And I have came across very interesting literatures about the ways in which intercultural universities try to put together Western knowledges, but also indigenous knowledges. Also, there are many initiatives to decolonize the curriculum, and this is very similar to what is happening in Africa, and particularly in South Africa, where there is a very strong movement to decolonize the university. In the end, the idea is trying to acknowledge that universities are spaces for different types of knowledges, not only one type of knowledge. And there are initiatives to recognize this and to value what is part of our history and our social reality. The problem here is that many of these ideas and initiatives, again, are invisible, at least outside Latin America. And also in some sectors of the academic world, for example, in Chile, you will find many academics who don't care about these matters, who are not interested in these issues because they want to publish international rankings and they are interested in trying to promote a way of being a university that emulates the global north. So this discourse, this narrative is to some extent invisible, not only outside Latin America, but also within some sectors of Latin America. So I'm going to finish here with the idea of internationalization and the idea of questioning the very concept of internationalization and the implications that internationalization has to countries with different histories and realities. Latin America, to some extent, is trapped between following these global trends and this world-class university model on the one hand, or trying to acknowledge the colonial legacy of our countries and our people. I think that many academic sectors here in Latin America try to make internationalization and a depoliticized concept. Sorry, it's a very difficult word for me. So trying to detach politics with being an international university, which is, let's say, a very technocratic way of thinking about the university. The problem is that when we do that, we are not connecting universities with colonial legacies, our territories, and our people. So, in the first place, we need to recognize the colonial legacy, and we can promote a series of initiatives that I have listed here, promoting a fair access to for indigenous students, decolonizing the curriculum, learning indigenous languages, learning new programs that are based on indigenous knowledges, trying to connect universities with indigenous communities, and recognize that many groups in our territories have been marginalized. We need critical perspectives about publications, about rankings, about inequities, about race discrimination. And also, we need to think seriously about the ways in which universities in Latin America have been working with transnational organizations to seek economic profit, for example. I'm not going to go there, but extractivism is an important matter in Latin America, and the ways in which universities support or contest these extractivist activities. Also, and I'm going to finish with this, South collaboration is important. During the first government, Lula's government in Brazil, for example, there was a very interesting initiative trying to promote collaboration among countries in Latin America, but also with Africa. The results are not fantastic, but at least there is an intention there. So the idea is trying to promote this collaboration among countries that belong to the global south. So I'm going to finish here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I would say that while you were really resistant to call yourself philosopher, maybe I can offer my type of defining what I understand as philosophy. You know, like to confront the quasi-universal concepts with the material reality of practices in higher education and blow up from within this universalizing concepts. This is what true philosophy is about. And thank you very much for doing exactly that with the concept of internationalization. And I would say that for those of you who were not present during our conversation on China, I would say this two seminars provided a substantial contribution to our discussion about ontology, like confronting the conceptual legacies and the practices connected with the conceptual legacies from the West and the North with the different higher education realities, where, like, for example, in the context of Latin America, we see that the imposed northern ontology of internationalization got involved in a historical legacies of a power matrix that Carolina mentioned and produced or cannot produce the beneficial outcomes that they promises. So thank you very much, Carolina. This was really important contribution to this seminar, and I open up the discussion. And if you want to ask questions or provide comments, please. Yeah, David produced a large comment in the chat. Maybe you would like to. Yeah.
Well, sorry. I'm under pressure here. We're leaving the country and moving, and the movers are here tearing the house apart. But I wanted to hear Carolina's presentation, which I found very interesting. So I tried to write a quick reflection on it just as a placeholder for a future conversation. But I have to go outside and make sure they don't take away all our furniture.
Okay. Good luck.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I can read the question by David, or you can consult it in the chat and maybe Carolina will respond. Carolina very interestingly posed set of issues and one's causing me many different reflections I would like to follow up. In particular, over 50 years in the US, I have seen the higher education move from diverse, mission-different, and importantly, different state universities, land-grant universities, colleges, liberal art colleges, religious colleges, and community colleges crushed into homogeneity under the aegis of what you describe as internationalization. Its impact in the US is internal colonialism, education as commodity for sale, and education as job training. So the hegemonic location is also so radically undermined. I'm sorry not to be able to okay, this was the remaining concept. So would you like to respond to this important issue about, you know, like this double-edged sword of internationalization and negative impact of this homogenizing impact of internationalization also on the hegemonic countries? What do you think about that, Carolina?
Yeah, I think that the matters I have been posing here are, as I mentioned, are also experiencing in the global north. This is not just a global south matter. And I don't know a lot about higher education in the United States, but I am very aware that there are different types of universities with different types of students. But what prevails is this group of very elite universities that lead the game and the rest are left behind. So when we think about elite universities in the United States, I'm very aware that it's a very, very small group of universities, and something similar occurs in the UK. It is not like all the universities in the United States or the UK are these world-class universities. There is a diversity in the system. There are different types of students, there is a lot of stratification, of course, and social inequities. And that means that the systems of higher education are very stratified and they are diverse. But also there are institutions that try to give a response to these differences. However, what prevails is one idea about being a university, this idea of world-class university, which in the end, I think is very damaging for the diversity and not only the diversity of institutions, but also to generate new ideas to think about the university.
Exactly. Okay, Soren was first and Tessa was second, so step in, please, Soren.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carolina, for a great talk. And I'm not really, I don't know anything really about internationalization. That's not my field. So maybe my question is off the mark. But I'm interested to know if you think the university, you seem to think there is still some hope in the university, because maybe you could also say that we need to abolish the university, because it's always tainted with this colonial past and this hegemony, and it can't really be solved. But on the other hand, you also say that you think the university is a way forward. So you still believe in the university as an institution, I sense. So why is that? Why do you think because there could be other forms of institutions for higher education, perhaps. Maybe universities are not necessary. And especially not because of the Western the anchoring to the Western history and so on. So why the university? Why not just get rid of them?
It's difficult to think about a world without universities. Although my talk could be seen as pessimistic, I'm very optimistic about universities, because I have been reading quite recently about this double role of universities in reproducing and reinforcing this colonial matrix, but at the same time in challenging this colonial matrix. So I think that universities, at least here, and I'm sure that in every part of the world, are very conflicted because there are these contending narratives. And so on the one hand, not only about internationalization, but also about other issues, we have on the one hand these very normative views about being a university, and on the other hand, we have critical voices, and also we have been able to create spaces to defy this colonial matrix here in Latin America. So I'm very optimistic, because I would say in the last 7 years, I have been able to find incredible work that has been led by different universities in the region, and what they are doing is absolutely amazing, but it's invisible. It's invisible, but it's there. And so my hope is that throughout the years, this movement will become stronger. I think there is a lot of hope as well, because there are other countries dealing with these matters. New Zealand is a very interesting case, and the way in which universities are trying to indigenize universities. Also, there are a lot of debates in Canada and Australia, and even in the United States. So I still believe in universities. I wouldn't abolish universities, because I think that they are quite special institutions, in the sense that, on the one hand, at least in Latin America, they reproduce the colonial matrix, but at the same time, they are able to propose ways forward to challenge this colonial matrix. And in that sense, I think there is a lot of hope to transform universities and make them more sensitive to our local needs.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Tessa?
Can you hear me? I'm in a cafe and it's a bit noisy. Is it okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you, Carolina, for your talk. That was really interesting. My field is actually internationalization, so I found it really interesting to hear what you were talking about. And I think if we were thinking a bit about definitions, which we spent some time thinking about, Hans de Wit is actually my supervisor. So I've thought a bit about the problem of the way definitions have evolved in this field. It's a young field. It's 25, 30 years old. And the definitions actually evolved from policy. So Hans de Wit and Jeanette were both policy professionals. So coming from that space into academia. So we have that challenge when we're working, like you said, between a policy arena and the academic arena, of that tension in the way we actually make definitions, right? So we move from definitions which are very functional in their basis to definitions that are actually representative of the ontological reality of university. So that distinction, I think it's Christian actually who's talked about under-theoretization in higher education. International higher education and internationalization is definitely one subfield that's severely under-theorized. So I think that's one of the challenges we see in the policy definition. But also I think when we stick to the policy definition, we also see that problem of the distinction between the narratives that do tend to be perpetuated in policy and practice, on the one hand, which yes, they're driven by prestige, etc. But are there also academic ideas about what internationalization can be or could be that shape different rationales and purposes for internationalization that I don't think we discussed as much? So things like supporting trust, building intercultural relationships. Are there ways to discuss that we could talk about a more ethical pathway for internationalization that recognize benefits that we could gain through internationalization processes, for instance, research collaboration, spaces for global public goods, solidarity beyond national borders. I recognize, and I think I appreciate the need for corrective justice and colonial legacy and the ongoing experience of coloniality in our societies, but I think there are ways, even the way you talk about New Zealand and Canada as models for thinking about ways forward, that show that there are, if we think about the university itself, ways of thinking about internationalization on top of our traditional purposes of the university that can be meaningful. I wonder if you could comment on that.
I think you are making very good points, Tessa. I don't know how to pronounce that. I think that the fact that policymakers or these transnational organizations such as the World Bank, UNESCO, and so on the one hand, and the academic world, on the other hand, come together, make some narratives very strong, very powerful. And this is the case of internationalization. So I completely agree with you. And I have seen that not only regarding internationalization, but also quality. You have this kind of interconnections between the policy world and the academic world. My concern, I mean, the policy world usually is normative. Yes? My concern about the academic world and the university is that we as academics need to be critical about these normative perspectives. And we cannot just take for granted what the policy world says about internationalization. So my concern there is that some academic sectors reinforce these policy discourses. And I believe that we have the power to be critical and reflective about these concepts. And I think, and this is my personal posture, my position, that we really need to be critical about this and think seriously about these matters. We cannot just reproduce what the World Bank says or what the UNESCO says. This is our role as universities, as academics. We need to promote these critical reflections about many issues, and one is internationalization. And I think that some academics try to do that, while others simply reproduce and reinforce these discourses. So there is a danger there. I think we have the responsibility to go beyond and be reflective and critical about these discourses. I agree with you that there are ethical dimensions regarding internationalization. Actually, I came across some ideas, especially from the International Association of Universities. And quite recently, I found a report referring to this ethical dimension of internationalization and recognizing asymmetries and so on. I acknowledge that. My concern is, though, that sometimes I feel that these are a bit of very empty discourses, because you have, it's a kind of normative discourse. We have to be ethical. We have to take into consideration geopolitical matters and so on. We have to be, we have to promote solidarity. I have found that. But I think that those kind of ideas need to connect with very concrete initiatives within universities, across universities. So sometimes I feel that, again, these are kind of normative discourses. We have to be ethical. We have to, and that is fine. But my worry is what happens afterwards. How can we deal with these matters in a concrete way? How can we be sensitive to colonial legacies? I acknowledge that there is an important first step in recognizing that we need an ethical dimension when we think about internationalization, but I also think that we need a step further. I don't know how to say it, not just saying it in a report, in a policy report. We need to go forward and we need to produce initiatives and way of thinking about internationalization that make these values and ideas real.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 3 more questions, so this is like a really hot topic. The Ron was first. There is one question in the chat by Stanisław, and final question by Luca. And I would say if we could take them as a series and then ask Carolina to respond to all of them, that would be the best way. So Ron, please.
I've certainly been given lots of food for thought here, and it's helped me rethink my idea of ontology. And I think it's helped me to see how complex the ontology of higher education is worldwide. And it seems to me Carolina's opened up for us all sorts of interesting dimensions to the ontology of higher education, which we might build on if there was something coming out of this series. So I'm getting a sense of an ontology of higher education here, which is fractured in various ways. you've got a dimension as between structures and discourses. I'll just go very quickly because I know others want to come in. So a dimension between structures and discourses or narratives, a dimension between internationalization as a description of the world and as recommendations about the world, and another dimension as between hegemony on the one hand and possible options for collaboration and greater understanding on the other. After all, universities have been international for the last 1,000 years. So I think there are lots of room here for further conversations and consideration and inquiry. And then we've got this last one, which Tessa has opened up for us, about optimism and pessimism. So I think there's masses to play for here. If I'd had time, I would have asked Carolina a question as to which of these dimensions Carolina feels is the strongest, or even as between structures and narratives, which of those are the strongest in helping us to understand internationalization. But there's probably not time for that, and others want to come in.
Okay. Okay, Luca, please, and then maybe we'll ask Staszek to read his question.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Carolina. For can you hear me well? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. While you were talking, and you mentioned literature that is not very accessible globally, or that is not read globally, we should say. I'm natively Italian, and so I can read Portuguese and Spanish well enough. Also, an author I draw a lot upon is Edgar Morin. I know is quite popular in Latin America, and there's this whole discussion about planetary citizenship as a different framing that is very distinct from globalization. And since you mentioned, we're talking about ontology, and since you mentioned indigenous ways of thinking, I was thinking what you imagine could be an internationalization that doesn't look at the ontology of markets and of globalization and of coloniality that you discuss, but at the ontology of the living systems of the land that indigenous ways of thinking are much more connected to. If we can have that internationalization, if it even makes sense to use that term, because the nation state is something that is very distant from the kind of relationship that indigenous people have with the land. So yeah, just wondering about your perspective. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Staszek is not with us anymore. Carolina, could you respond to this too?
So Luca, what is your question? Can you state it again?
Yes, I
agree with you. I mean, I agree with you, but perhaps we don't need to use the very concept of internationalization, and we can use this concept of planetary citizenship or sustainable university or embodied university, a university that is connected with the lands and the bodies of the people who inhabit universities. I completely agree with you.
There was no real question. It was I was sharing this, and I was just wanting to hear more about your perspective about this different way of perceiving the ontology of the university in relationship with the world. We use this word in English, and we use global in English. Other words in English don't sound grammatically correct, and maybe are more useful. So I was wondering about that as non-English speakers, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with your question, and then I'm going to address Ron comments. The issue here is that I think that universities in Latin America are, to some extent, split. So internationalization is still a very important concept. Sometimes I would love to get rid of it, but I don't think it's possible. It has permeated the university in a very strong way. Perhaps in 10 or 20 years, we won't talk about internationalization anymore, and we are going to talk about sustainability because of all the problems that we are facing right now. But right now, internationalization is a very important concept. I would say that Latin America follows Western ways of defining internationalization in an important way. So it's there and it's important. It's important for universities, it's important for policy, it's important for the government, and it's real. It's real in the sense that I'm going to give an example. In Chile, it's so real that we are crazy about international rankings. We receive incredible rewards when we publish in English in Quarter One Web of Science journals. So it's very real because these narratives shape not only universities, but the way we are as academics. I mean, these narratives shape my own work and the way I write or where I publish, for example. So they are real and important. However, that doesn't mean that we cannot reflect on them and contest them and try to dismantle them. And I believe, and this connects with what Ron was mentioning, the concept or the poles of optimism and pessimism. So sometimes I think that there is a lot of pessimism around the university and the ways in which it succumbs and to these global trends, these hegemonic narratives, and the ways in which these powerful structures shape universities and academic life. However, I am also very optimistic because I think that we are able to create spaces for critical reasoning and critical spaces to think about what we need and what the university should do in order to acknowledge our necessities. So in this sense, I think that all these narratives coexist. In Latin America, the Western narrative of internationalization is strong, is real, is concrete. But at the same time, narratives can challenge structures. And critical voices, critical narratives are necessary to change the structures. But I think that, and in that sense, I am optimistic. I don't think that the structures cannot be changed. To the contrary, I think that the more we have critical voices, the better, because we can challenge these structures. So there are a lot of spaces for optimism. And as academics, we have a very important role and responsibility in trying to defy and challenge these hegemonic narratives. So I don't know whether I'm addressing both comments. And also, this is the issue of publications, Luca. This is not only about publishing in Spanish or Portuguese. I can read a bit of Italian as well. It's the matter on where you publish. So it's a kind of double, there is a reinforcement between language. So for example, if I publish in a very prestigious journal in Spanish, there aren't very many, but there are some. If I publish in Spanish in a very prestigious journal, I have fewer possibilities to be read by scholars in the global north. And even in the global south, if I write in Spanish, they will read me, but it's going to be that kind of knowledge is going to be quite local. So there is the issue of language, but also the issue of where I publish. So the prestige matter is very important here. I need to publish in both in English and in a very prestigious journal. And that means, in order to get this status of international scholar, but that means that many of my colleagues, for example, are not going to read my stuff, not only because they don't want to, because we don't have access. We don't pay to these companies. We don't pay Springer, we don't pay Elsevier, so we don't have access to the papers. That is a concrete matter. But also because very few people in Latin America are fluent in English. So there are many issues here. It's the issue of language, it's the issue of prestige, but also the cost of the publications.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Oh, there's one remark, I hope, from Martin.
Hello, Carolina. Yes, thanks if you allow
Hi,
me.
Martin.
Yeah, all right there. Yes, so I've got maybe a challenging sort of thought, which is about what you identify one of the problems for at least Latin American institutions is trying to emulate the best universities of the global north, but I haven't got a sense of what alternative thing would be in its place, and I'm not sure if you're wavering about that. You know, there's an ideal good university, and it isn't just the sort of institutions we have in the global north and the way they behave now. And so there's a question about, you know, how much does your argument apply outside the issue of internationalization and the rankings game? A universal concept might be possible without entailing homogenization of the worst sort, which is most of us, people have been saying that I would agree is happening, too much homogenization, but the universal concept, which is the basis of universal principles, maybe is you know, we don't want to throw that out as well, shall we say? And one example of doing it differently might be, and you offer these, is decolonization of curricula, for example. But if that means throwing out what's often termed Western knowledge, then you know, what would you say to the thought then that what you're doing is denying the universities in the global south, say, of access to what is knowledge that arguably works better? You know, it's you don't let them have access to it, but it's work for the global north. Then why shouldn't it work for the global south? And if you stop it, then you're actually making things worse. So that wouldn't be a way to do it differently if you wanted a different sort of university. So that'd be a sort of more specific example. And do you see that's a good strategy still, or is there still a universal concept behind the university, which in its current form is an invention of Europe, in the universities we know them now?
Thank you, Martin. I don't think that the solution is throwing out Western knowledges or Western universities. I don't think that is the solution, because that creates a lot of polarization, and we cannot deny that there is scientific knowledge, scientific progress. When we think about the pandemic, for example, and the vaccination, much of the research comes from universities. So we cannot deny that. And I think it would be wrong to do it. I read a very interesting article yesterday about the indigenization of universities in New Zealand that was published in University World News. And these very extreme solutions is like, okay, we are going to deconstruct Western universities, we are going to throw away monuments, and we are going to destroy symbols. I think that is a very extreme solution, and I don't agree with that. Rather, I think that the fact that it is possible to put into conversation different types of knowledges is part of the solution. And I came across some experiences here in Latin America in which the curriculum tries to do that. I'm not saying that it's a successful initiative, but at least there is the intention of putting into conversation, for example, in medicine, Western knowledges in the curriculum, but also a lot of knowledge that comes from indigenous communities. And that type of knowledge in health and medicine is important for the local communities. I'm not saying that we can export those knowledges to universities in Europe. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the idea is trying to value knowledge that is valuable for indigenous communities in medicine, for example, here in some universities in some countries in Latin America. But at the same time, those students, those medicine students, have access to Western knowledge. And it's very interesting to put these two types of knowledges together and think about them. And I think that that is part of what has been called ecologies of knowledges by De Sousa Santos. And I think it is possible to do it. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think one of the solutions has to do with acknowledging that there are other types of knowledges. And sometimes those knowledges are considered non-scientific knowledges. And for universities, that can be very challenging, very challenging.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you all for coming to our seminar. I have one announcement because we have one final seminar of the series. Seminar will be given by Søren Bengtsen on dark ontology, the university as a rift. And the seminar will take place on June 28th. 1 o'clock Central Eastern European time, and we will be sending the announcements this week with the link to registration and the details about the seminar. So thank you very much, and see you, some of you, in Poland during the conference.
There is a conference.
Yeah, there is an annual conference of APATSES in Gdańsk next week. So, yeah, happy to see you all, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.